Greetings, I'm Zachary Hepner. I'm pleased to share this Dvar Torah with you for Parashat Mishpatim. The connections between the seduction of Dinah narrative in Genesis 34 and the laws of the seducer in the Exodus's covenant code requires a close reading. In Genesis 34, Jacob and sons return to Canaan, the land that God has already promised to Jacob and his future generations. Dinah, a young, un-betrothed virgin, is seduced by Shehem ben Hamor, the Hivvite. Hamor proposes marriage between Shehem, his son, and Dinah with the benefits of naturalization. Jacob and his entourage would become Hivvite citizens with the benefits of land ownership. The sons of Israel insist on circumcision for such a pact. Shehem and all citizens undergo circumcision. Subsequently, Shimon and Levi arm themselves with swords and kill every living being in Shehem. Jacob chastises his two sons, and they respond that she is being treated like a harlot. Now let's start with a close reading of Parashat Mishpatim. The law of the seducer is preceded by a law of leased objects. If the lessee is with the broken object or animal, shalem yeshalem. If not, lo yeshalem. If its owner was with it, no restitution be made. But if it was hired, that payment is due. This means that there are differences in liability if the owner of the animal is with the animal at the time of the damage or animal's death. It continues, v'chiyefate ish, the law of the seducer. Mahor yimharena lo liisha. And then, kemohar habetulot. If a man seduces a virgin for whom the bride price had not been paid and lies with her, he must make her his wife by payment of mohar, the bride price. Skip the verses about the sorceress. The next verse is kol shochev im behema yomotimat, the capital prohibition against bestiality. Then the law of proscription, cherem, to whoever sacrifices other laws. Zoveach leElohim yochoram, the law of cherem. Then the laws against oppressing the orphan and widow with drastic divine consequences. Now to the Dinah narrative. Hamor's naturalization sermon to the Hivvite inhabitants, ha'anashim ha'ele shleimim hemitanu. They come in peace, shalom, echoes balav enimo shalem yishalem, and in balav imo lo yishalem. Shalem and shalom and shleimim, which echoes husbands and restitution. Im sachir hu ba bischaro, the day laborer's wage loosely echoes the brothers' retort to Jacob. That's Shimon and Levi, that Dinah was treated like a day prostitute. Hachazonah yaseh et achotenu. Now to the law of the seducer, v'chiyafate ish. It's directly linked to the unclear rape or seduction of Dinah. Mahor yimharena, the marriage payment to the girl, is a requirement to marry the girl post haste. This resonates with Shechem's words, harbu alai mohar umatan. I will excessively give her mohar, marital obligations, and a dowry. The text makes it clear that Jacob did not refuse. He did not. Ma'ain yema'ain aviha. He did not refuse the marriage, so he declined mohar habetulot, the virgin's monetary punitive obligation. The prohibition against bestiality echoes the name Hamor, while patronymics in the Bible are telling of the nature of the narrative and the people with the patronymic. In this case, Hamor is a character, yet such an unusual name indicates that Hamor and possibly Dinah, in their participation with this seduction, had violated the law of bestiality, which is a condemnable act. The subsequent law of cherem, one who sacrifices with other gods will experience cherem, which is utter destruction. This echoes the complete, vast, destructive method that Shimon and Levi destroy the city. like a cherem, killing all the living creatures and inhabitants. The law against oppressing the stranger, widow, and orphan uses the words toneh, te'anun, aneh, ta'aneh. These variant conjugations of oppression echo sexual oppression, which is what Shehem did to Dinah when he lied with her. The verse says, vayi'aneha. He sexually oppressed her. This ambiguous word could be interpreted almost like a Janus word in the opposite direction, but the Bible is making it clear that her Stockholm yearning for Shehem ben Hamor afterwards was of no legal consequence. He had violated the law of oppressing the stranger, since Dinah was not a Hivvite citizen, and his oppressing was condemnable by sword. The verse then says, "They will cry to me, I will surely hear them, and I will kill the oppressor by sword." Not surprisingly, the Torah specifies the armament of Shimon and Levi. They arm themselves with their swords. To recap, the strangers who are non-citizens had been oppressed and exacted retribution in the manner of cherem. Parenthetically, and without going too much into this explains Jacob's complaint of the word achartem oti. You have befouled me with the inhabitants. My father, my Avi Mari, explicitly explains in his book Legal Friction on page 497 to page 501 that this language in Genesis 34 is linked to the laws of proscription, and in that section, as always, a worthwhile read, and it is also linked to Achan's proscription in the book of Joshua. But why? Why are the laws of the covenant code related in any way to the Dinah narrative? I'd like to suggest two answers. The first is a speculative one, and the second one is a grand slam. The first suggestion is that the peculiar patronymic Hamor, which means donkey, echoes the great Akkadian Babylonian leader who gave generations of Bible scholars a plethora of graduate degrees and articles. It's the sixth Amorite king who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BCE, Hammurabi, also known as Hammurabi. Bible scholars, believers, deniers, agnostics have gone to town connecting the dots between the laws of Hammurabi's code and the covenant code. From Hammurabi's Lex Talonius, the law of exacting retribution, which is commonly known from the covenant code's similar language of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I quote Sarna in his book Exploring Exodus, page 164, quote, "The most comprehensible, best arranged, almost sophisticated, and best preserved of the cuneiform laws collected is that of Hammurabi, 1728 to 1686 BCE, the great empire builder of Babylon, inscribed on a black diorite stele about 8 feet high. It is the crown glory of the Mesopotamian jurisprudence. It stood long in the temple of Asaglia in Babylon." End quote. The suggestion here is that the Hammurabi Code way too neatly fits in the same century time frame as the Jacob story. The intellectual forefront of civilization, the great metropolis with laws and jurisprudence not capriciously decided by partial judges. The Torah is poetically taunting the name that Hamor, that Hammurabi, is an ass. Hammurabi is the great or exalted ass. Shehem ben Hamor is an indication of the time this narrative is taking place, and that the Hivvite inhabitants considered themselves the Canaanite metropolis avant-garde. How ironic! The moral deprivation of a society with its sophisticated laws who, quote, ignore the cry of the stranger, widow, and orphan. The Dinah narrative is not condemning the actions of some backwater hick town, but the Berlin of the 17th century BCE, elite high culture mistreating the stranger, the orphan, the widow. The covenant code tells us that at the ends of these civilizations, God hearkens the cry of the oppressed, and cherem is meted out to such a society by sword. Now for a very different answer. Rabbi Yitzchak Etzshalom has observed that Jacob's dilemma in the Dinah narrative is a thematic one that spans the entire book of Genesis. God had already promised the land of Canaan to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when God makes such a promise, it would seem offensive to the Almighty to also make a backup pact with the Hivites in order to become citizens and subsequently get rights to legally own and inherit land. Pum fakert. Jacob chose to say nothing because there was no good solution. You can't tell the Hivites to scram. They would become belligerent. And you can't accept their terms. It's offensive to God. There is no good solution. So remain silent. With the aforementioned links between this part of the covenant code and the Dinah narrative, it would be no surprise to pay attention to the most overlooked section of this week's parsha, the postscript to the covenant code, and the preamble to the famous Naaseh v'nishma, chapter 23, verses 26 to 33. None shall miscarry or be barren. I will fill your days. I will send terror before you. The Canaanite residents will be in discomfort, and your enemies will turn their backs to you. I will send the hornet, which will drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites. I will not drive them out quickly. You will be increased and inherit the land, from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistine, to the wilderness, to the river. And listen carefully. The next verse is, make no covenant with them nor their gods. They will not dwell in your land, and if they do, they will be a religious snare to you. Jacob was silent. He didn't need to fight because God will send the hornet. He couldn't make a pact. That would violate the covenant code. Using postmodern terminology, Simon and Levi climbed the forbidden wall. In other words, their instructions was to do nothing but wait, but they may have violated the covenant code by not letting God send the hornets. Let's recap. The questionable seduction of Dinah is in Genesis 34, and the covenant code is in Exodus 22. Many of the words and themes in Genesis 34 resonate and echo the laws in chapter 22 of the covenant code, not surprisingly, because that section deals with inui, affliction, a word which can also mean sexual affliction. The fate of the Hivvite inhabitants echo the fate enumerated in Mishpatim. One suggestion is that 34 is linked to the covenant code by prosaically making fun of the great ass Hamor, who had a law code but lacked in godly morals. The second suggestion make the main character to be Jacob, who refused to violate the covenant code by even in such a dire situation to make any pact with the Hivites, because the land had already been guaranteed from the Almighty for Jacob's descendants. I would like to make two end notes. The first verses later, the Torah does mention that the inhabitants of the land were instilled with fear, just as it's described in Mishpatim, and they did in fact not attack Jacob. It seems that Jacob's silence was a fulfillment of his side of the covenant code. One final endnote, I suggestively wonder if the strange eulogy of Rebekah's maidservant, Devorah, which could mean bumblebee, could have something to do with God's charged hornet in the covenant code. That's food for thought. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom.